So before we get to literature review findings, we're going to talk to you quite a bit about literature review methods, which is basically what this section is about. And we really started with a set of papers. Last February, the National Center on Performance Initiatives at Vanderbilt University hosted a conference, and we found tips from that conference, and actually Ruben Jacobson, the other research assistant, and I reviewed all of those papers. And that was kind of our starting point, our entree, if you will, into literature. And after we read these papers, we were like, holy crap, this body of literature has lots and lots of tentacles. And we really had to find a way to tame it, to put some boxes around what we were going to look at and what we weren't going to look at, because there was a lot there. So our team decided the best way to get at that was to really identify streams of literature. So in order to identify our streams of literature, we looked at these three sources. The papers, first of all, that we had read. We also looked at the study research questions, and we looked at what we knew about the first project, which is the initiative in Prince George's County. So we took those three things together, and out of them we built these streams of literature. We really narrowed it down to 5 pretty broad categories. The first of them being the local construction of paper performance or teacher incentives, really, in Prince George's County, and the context of those incentives, the state context, the union context, all around. Our second stream really was about programs, initiatives that have happened elsewhere. We looked at the chronology of how these events passed, the tracking of current initiatives, features of all of these experiments, whether unions were involved or not involved, why districts said they were trying to do this, things like that. The third body was evidence of effectiveness of these experiments. So this is more descriptive, the second category. The third is empirical. The fourth category, measurement issues. And that really described, that category is really about how teachers and principals and educators in general are evaluated. And we turned quite a bit to the specific measures used in Prince George's County model, and we will get to those later. And then finally we looked at theoretical literature, that being in education and some of it outside of education. But as you can see, we started at 0 feet, right on the concrete, and we worked our way up to 10,000 with the theory. So once we had the streams identified, then we really decided we had to build a literature base. And so we really had 3 primary approaches to this. First was snowball. We, source by source, we went through and culled the reference list of all of everything we read. We did hand searches of relevant materials, and that included websites, journals, conference proceedings, and the popular press. And we also did some database searches by author's name, by key terms, and things like that. We limited our search to 1985 to the present, and that is because the prior wave of teacher incentives ended in the mid-'80s, and so there was pretty sufficient literature review to look at from before that time. Betty had actually written one of those. But we also realized that there's quite a bit of ongoing research, so we may have to add to our literature review as we go on. And then from all of this, we identified 500 texts that could be potential sources, and that's a few too many. So we had to then prioritize, and all of these kind of happen concurrently, the prioritizing, the reviewing, and things like that. So we prioritized our sources, though, according to author. Was this author someone who had written extensively and for quite a long time on paper performance and teacher incentives? We looked at the outlet. Was it a peer-reviewed journal? Was it a white paper out of a think tank? And we also looked at the centrality of the topic. We found that some topics were very central to what we were doing. We found that some were more background, some were more peripheral, and we kind of labeled them as such and used them in that way. And so from those, we reviewed 120 or so texts. And for each review, we had 2 team members review the piece and fill out a matrix. So now that you know kind of how we went building our literature base, I'm going to tell you what we found out. But instead of starting on the ground and moving to 10,000 feet, we're going to start at 10,000 feet and work our way down. So I think that Clarissa is going to come and talk to you about theory.
Hi, good afternoon. As Paul explained, we reviewed quite a bit of theoretical literature to try to gain an understanding of how and why incentives in general and specific to education are supposed to work, or in some cases not work. So as we began to review and crystallize the material, we noticed that many of the frameworks that were used in the theoretical literature had a base in theories of economics and theories of motivation. Theories of economics, one of the overarching themes in those theories is that people respond to incentives, and those incentives can be money or public recognition or maybe a promotion. So in incentive theory, incentives are perceived to be positive reinforcers, or stated differently, theorists believe that incentives increase productivity and influence performance. Motivation theory, on the other hand, typically explores the ways in which different factors, and in our case incentives, affect behavior or encourage or discourage individuals' motivation to put forth some type of effort. But what was interesting about the motivation theories is that it cut across various fields and schools of thought, so the fields of sociology, psychology, education, and even economics has their own take on how motivations work. And we did see some overlap between the different schools of thought. But as it relates to education specifically and the incentives, we saw that most of the discussion was a debate on whether intrinsic or extrinsic rewards motivate people. So as far as educators, is it money, recognition, or is it personal satisfaction that motivates them to do their job? Further discussions concerning pay incentives in the field of education demonstrated that the theories of action for pay incentives for educators has its origins in the private sector. So the theories of actions have been taken from the private sector and then adapted to education. And in the private sector, we know it's very much results oriented, and they tend to take into consideration the principles of supply and demand, and also base their actions on the notion that incentives induce performance or increase productivity. So the assumption is that if we apply private sector characteristics to the education sector in the form of financial incentives, we can improve and enhance the teaching force, especially given the current state of education where much is based on performance, accountability, and tangible results such as test scores. So that was a broad overview on the literature that we read, and now we get into some of the leading propositions. And one of the propositions that kept popping up over and over was well, not a fact, but the theory that money matters. And what's really important to understand here is that many theorists are saying that money matters just as much to educators as it does to doctors and lawyers and people of professions, despite common belief. And a lot of the theory-based literature speculates that the current pay system in public education or education take into consideration that money also matters to teachers. So the single salary pay scale where teachers are paid the same depending on the level of education and their experience in the field. The single salary schedule, which says everyone gets paid the same rate. Theorists are saying that this just is not compatible with the way that the system is set up, and it does not allow for enough flexibility in pay and differentiation in pay, and it also doesn't really allow any incentive to do a good job or to pay attention to the practice or to develop myself professionally. Also, the single salary schedule thinks that for those people who do come into the profession, in the education profession, it doesn't really give them any incentive to, again, pay attention to practice or to develop professionally. So given the theory that money matters, this is then considered a high value variable. The money piece is a high value variable. So the theory is that if that's the high value variable, then it's that variable that we need to alter in order to affect change in practice and performance